Human envoy, the treaty waits for your answer. James, choose carefully. One wrong name could end peace. Then I need to choose the truth. James, don't do this. Solara is the approved choice.
You should not look at me. They will punish you for it.
I'm not choosing what they approve. I'm choosing who they fear. Speak the name, human. I choose Theora.
Why would you choose the marked one?
Episode 1. The Choice. There were two women standing in that hall. One was everything the Velon Empire considered perfect. The other had copper threads in her silver hair, natural markings on her skin that her society called a genetic flaw, and one ear that sat slightly higher than the other. James Carter already knew which name he was going to say. This is the story of why. The grand hall of Meridian Station smelled like ozone and something faintly floral. James stood among 5 other human envoys near the western entrance, dressed in formal diplomatic gray, trying to look calmer than he felt. His collar pulled slightly. He had been wearing the uniform for 2 hours and already hated it. Across the hall, 6 Velon women stood in a precise line along the eastern wall. Silver hair that caught the overhead lights and scattered them differently than any human hair James had ever seen. Ears that swept backward in long, elegant curves. Skin that seemed to generate its own faint glow from underneath, as though something warm lived just below the surface. They stood in perfect stillness, not the stillness of people being patient, but the stillness of people for whom patience was not a concept that applied. James's colleague Richard Mercer appeared at his elbow. "Third from the left," Richard said, keeping his voice low. "Solara of House Versian. I read her file 3 times on the shuttle. Top diplomat in their entire generation. And look at her." James looked. She was striking. They all were. "They all look impressive," he said. "No, you are not listening," Richard said. "She looks like she runs the place." James was no longer listening. He was scanning the line for a different face. He did not find it there. He found it further along, slightly apart from the others, standing closer to the wall. A woman with her hands clasped in front of her, and her head inclined at a small downward angle. Her silver hair was shot through with threads of copper that absorbed the overhead light and gave it back warmer. Her skin carried natural markings the others did not have. Intricate patterns moving across her face and down her arms in swirls and branches, like a map drawn on her that had never been finished. One of her ears sat slightly higher than the other. James stopped breathing. Theora. 5 years of memory came back in a single second. Not the official version. The one in the closed debrief file. The real one. His survey pod had malfunctioned during a stellar mapping run, and he had made an emergency landing on a planet logged as uninhabited. That much was true. What the file did not contain was the part where he lay in a crater, looking up at a sky the wrong shade of blue, knowing his environmental suit had been compromised on impact, calculating that he had a few hours at most. He had heard footsteps before he saw her, careful steps in the underbrush, deliberate, not hiding but not careless either. Then a face looked down at him from the edge of the crater, and the expression on that fraught face was one he had spent 5 years trying to describe. Not horror, not calculation, something more like a decision being made. She climbed down and pulled him out alone. He never fully understood how. She was roughly his height, but more slender, and he had been dead weight in a damaged suit. She got him to a small scientific outpost hidden in the tree line, cut away the compromised sections of his suit, got clean air to him, and then spent the next hour using materials from her pack to make something that, when she pressed it against the gash in his side, started to actually work. He asked her name. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said it. Theora. 3 weeks. That was how long the rescue team took to find him. And in those 3 weeks, he and Theora built something out of necessity and time, and a shared refusal to let the language barrier win. She taught him Velon by pointing at things, patient and methodical, repeating words until he had them, correcting his pronunciation without impatience. He mangled it badly enough that she occasionally laughed, a real laugh, genuine and slightly surprised, as though she had forgotten that was a thing she did. She told him about her work in pieces, botanical surveys and ecological mapping. In the evenings when they sat outside, watching the wrong-colored sky go dark, she described her homeworld. She said the name of her house, House Malin, in a tone that told him more than the words did. The slight flatness, the brief pause before the name. On day 22, she heard the rescue shuttle before he did. She stood up and listened to something he could not hear, and then she looked at him with an expression he could not read and said, in careful Velon he was only just beginning to understand, "You should go." And then she walked back into the tree line and was gone before the shuttle touched down. He had spent 5 years not letting that be the end. The High Mediator, an elderly Velon woman whose silver hair was precisely and uniformly silver, stepped to the center of the hall. "We gather today to witness the beginning of a new era," she said. Standard language for standard occasions. James had sat through enough of these to know when to tune them out. But his attention kept coming back to Theora, standing slightly apart from the others, still looking at the floor. The Velon women from the higher houses had arranged themselves with a subtle geometry that left a few extra centimeters of space around her. Not hostility. Something older than that. A habit so ingrained it had stopped being a choice. The pairings began. Ambassador Helena Cross paired with Lysara of House Varanthia. Diplomat Marcus Wong with a representative from House Aerith. Pairing after pairing. The higher status, Velon women chosen first in an order that left no ambiguity about where each person ranked. Theora did not look up once. Richard got Solara. He stepped forward with barely concealed relief, and James heard Solara say something in measured Velon that made Richard smile, even though he almost certainly did not understand it. Then it was just James on one side of the hall and Theora on the other. "In this case," the mediator said, and something in her tone signaled that this was unusual. "Traditional protocols for singular selection apply. James Carter, you are invited to confirm your partner from the remaining candidate." She gestured toward where Solara and Richard now stood. "Solara of House Versian is bonded to your colleague. The remaining candidate," a pause that made remaining sound like leftover, "is Theora of House Malin. James Carter, confirm your partner." Nobody in that hall thought there was an actual choice to make. Richard was already watching with the expression of someone who knew the punchline. Several gallery delegates had begun the kind of low murmur that preceded formalities that were only technically formalities. James thought about 5 years of closed doors and classified files and petition forms and waiting lists. All of it done for the purpose of finding his way back to one specific conversation. He did not hesitate. "Theora of House Malin," he said, "she is my choice." The silence that followed had weight. Not an absence of sound, but a presence of something else. The held breath of 200 people recalibrating at once. Then it broke into noise, disorganized and layered. The reaction of a room that had not been prepared for this. Richard said what in genuine confusion. "Velon," whispers moved through the eastern gallery too fast for James to follow. He was not looking at any of them. Across the hall, Theora's head had come up the moment her name was said. Her eyes found his, amber gold with small darker flecks scattered through the iris, and the expression on her face moved through recognition, through disbelief, and landed somewhere that made his chest hurt. "The selection is confirmed," the mediator said, in the tone of someone choosing the most neutral possible language for something that was not neutral at all. "James Carter and Theora of House Malin are bonded as diplomatic partners." James walked toward her. The hall watched him go. She had not moved. Her marked hands were pressed together in front of her. Up close he could see that she was trembling. Small controlled tremors. The kind of shaking that happened when someone was working very hard not to look like they were shaking. Her eyes tracked his approach with an intensity that felt like it cost her something. He stopped a few feet away and said, in Velon that still was not quite right, the greeting she had taught him in the 3rd week of their time together. "I have been looking for you." Her breath came out in something that was not quite a word. Slowly her marked hand rose and settled into his offered palm. "You remember," she said. Her voice was quiet. Unsteady, everything he said, every word. Behind them, an official was already moving to intercept them. From the gallery, a newsfeed captured it all. Somewhere in the station's communication network, the image was already moving. 2 figures in the center of a ceremonial hall. One human, one Velon, one of them perfectly suited to the moment by every standard that had been used to design it, and one of them standing there anyway. They turned together to face whatever was coming next. Episode 2, The Cost. The walk to their assigned quarters was the longest James had taken in recent memory, not because of the distance, but because of everything happening around them. A Velon official fell into step behind them, kept pace for half a minute, then peeled away without speaking. 2 human delegates passed them going the other direction. One caught James's eye, with a look somewhere between impressed and alarmed. A pair of younger Velon staff stopped talking when they rounded a corner and saw Theora. James did not catch what they said after the two of them passed, but Theora's fingers tightened briefly around his hand before relaxing again. She had not let go of his hand since the ceremony. He had not suggested she should. The suite was elegant in the way of spaces designed by committee. Everything chosen to offend no one. Adaptive furniture, adjustable lighting, a wide observation window that looked out at the stars with the clarity you only got this far from an atmosphere. The door sealed behind them. Theora let go of his hand. She moved to the center of the room and stopped there, her back to him. "You should not have done that," she said finally. Her voice was quiet, the controlled quiet of someone who had been practicing it for a long time. "I made a choice," James said. She turned. "James, do you understand what the selection means to them? It is not just a pairing ceremony. It is a statement. Two species presenting their best to each other. And you chose." She gestured at herself. They think you did it to insult them. I did not do it to insult anyone. I know that. But they do not." She crossed her arms, not in defense. More like she was holding herself together from the outside. The people who decide whether this treaty means anything are currently deciding whether you just committed a diplomatic act of contempt. There are consequences I know how to manage, and you do not. Because you have not spent your entire life inside those consequences. James pulled out a chair and sat down. Because he thought it might help if one of them stopped being ready to move. "Tell me," he said. She sat across from him, not close, a careful distance. "My markings are called chaos marks in the official language of the High Council," she said. "It is a clinical term. It means the patterns indicate genetic instability, a disruption in sequencing that their refinement programs have been eliminating for generations. House Malin has had marked members for 6 generations. We are a minor house to begin with, and the markings have kept us minor. The higher houses do not marry into us. We do not get senior postings. We do not get invited to events like this one." She paused. "I was included because tradition requires 6 pairs, and no house was willing to send a marked representative. I was the compromise that made the number work." James said nothing. "I knew what I was coming here as," she continued. "I knew I would be last chosen, the one nobody wanted. I have known that my entire life. You learn to anticipate it, to not let the anticipation show, to wait through it. And then your name was called, and you were standing there, and you said mine." She stopped. "I looked for you," James said. "After the rescue, I filed for the planetary survey data, and it came back classified. I tried in a Gamphotropology access channel and hit a wall. I petitioned for a cultural exchange program and spent 2 years on a wait list, followed by 18 months of Earthside work. Every path had something in the way." He leaned forward. "I studied Velon sociology for 5 years, not because my career required it, because I needed to understand your world well enough to find my way back into it." Theora was watching him with the careful attention of someone who had learned to listen for the moment a story stopped adding up. 5 years, she said. "You could have moved on." "I know. 3 weeks. James, we could barely speak to each other for the first half of it. Because you were the first person who looked at me like I was worth the effort," he said, and the simplicity of it came out without planning. "When I was lying in that crater thinking I was going to die there, you showed up and made a decision. Not a strategic one, not a calculated one. You did it because you thought it was right. And then for 3 weeks you treated me like a person, like someone whose questions mattered, like someone worth talking to. That does not go away just because time passes." The quiet that followed was different from before, less like held breath and more like something settling. "I thought about you," Theora said. "When your shuttle left, I stood in the tree line and I watched it go, and I thought, I hope he is all right. I hope he got home." She looked at her hands. "After a while I stopped thinking he will come back. I just thought, I hope he is well. The way you think about someone you do not expect to see again." And then you walked into that ceremony. Something close to a smile crossed her face. "You looked terrified, by the way. Your colleague looked excited. You looked like someone about to do something that would probably go badly." "That is accurate," she huffed. Not quite a laugh, but the ghost of one. "You said the greeting, the one I taught you. Your pronunciation is still wrong. I have been practicing it for 5 years, and somehow it is still wrong." This time it was closer to a laugh, genuine and slightly surprised at itself. and hearing it after years of only having the memory of it did something to his chest he did not have a word for. Then the sound faded, and she looked at her hands again, and the weight came back into her face. "They will call for an explanation," she said. "The council. They may request your removal. James, I am not worth the treaty. You are not being weighed against the treaty. The treaty is separate." A chime cut through the room. Sharp. "Official. Council summons," Theora said. Her voice returned to flat and practiced. She stood, smoothing her formal robes. "They want you. Based on the protocol code, they want me there too." "Good," James said. "Then let us go." The Council of Estic's chamber held 12 Velon officials in a precise semicircle, each seated above the central floor where James and Theora now stood. 12 faces carrying the specific beauty of a society that had spent centuries defining what beauty was and breeding toward it. They looked at James with expressions ranging from formal neutrality to something approaching contempt. They looked at Theora as though she were a problem that had arrived unexpectedly and was refusing to leave. At the far right of the semicircle, one official watched with a different quality of attention. He was older than the others, carrying his age as reinforcement rather than diminishment. His silver hair was the perfect uniform silver of the highest Velon lineages. Even seated, he radiated the particular stillness of someone who had been the most important person in every room he had ever entered. Lord Kisson of House Ariel. The lead counselor spoke. "James Carter, you made a selection today that requires explanation. I am happy to explain." James said. "Go ahead and ask." A brief pause. They had not expected that. "Theora of House Malin presents visible markers of genetic instability." The counselor continued. "Her markings, her coloring, her asymmetrical features indicate biological deviation from standards our society has refined over many generations. In the bonding exchange, she represented the lowest available selection. Your choice of her over Solar of House version is difficult to interpret as anything other than deliberate." "Deliberate? Yes," James said. "Insulting? No." "Then explain what it is." He told them everything. The crash, the crater, the compromised suit, the hours he had known he had left, footsteps in the underbrush, a face at the edge of the crater, deciding, 3 weeks of shelter, botanical medicines made from plants neither of them was supposed to be studying, a language built word by patient word. "She did all of this," he said, knowing that if she were discovered, she would face exile from all social contact. For a Velon, that is not a punishment, that is an ending. She did it anyway because she found a dying stranger and decided that leaving him to die was wrong. Her markings indicate nothing except natural variation, he continued. In human culture, people have freckles, birthmarks, skin patterns of every kind. We have learned to see diversity as beauty, not defect. Her markings look like star maps drawn on skin. Her hair catches light in ways I find fascinating. Her ears are part of a face that showed me nothing but kindness when I had given her no reason for it." He turned and spoke to Theora directly. "To me, she is beautiful, not despite her differences, but partly because of them. They make her unique and real. But her true beauty is in her actions, in who she is. If your society cannot see that, then your vision is what needs examining." "Not her." Theora was crying silently, her marked hands pressed to her mouth. At the far right of the semicircle, Lord Kisson had not moved. He watched James with the expression of a man filing information away for later use. Then one of the younger counselors spoke. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "the human raises points worth considering." "Heresy," another counselor said. "Perspective," the young one replied. "We invited humans into partnership precisely because they see things differently. What is the value of partnership if we reject every different viewpoint?" Debate broke out among the council. The lead counselor raised a hand for silence. "This matter requires further consideration. The pairing stands as exchange traditions allow no rescission." James Carter, understand that your choice carries weight you may not have anticipated. "Good," James said. "Let it carry it." They were dismissed. In the corridor outside, Kisson fell into step behind them for exactly 7 seconds before peeling away without a word. The message was clear. This conversation was not finished. That night, while Theora slept, James sat at the workstation, reading through diplomatic briefing documents that were neutral in tone and deeply worried in content. At 340, an incoming message chimed. Low priority signal, not official channels. He opened it. "You speak truth. Some of us are listening." Keep speaking. No name, no house identifier. He read it 3 times. Then he set the pad down and looked at the stars through the observation window. Theora appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, her silver-copper hair loose, her formal robes replaced with something simpler. She made the warming drink she had introduced him to 5 years ago and brought them both over, sitting closer than the night before. "This came in about an hour ago," James said, holding out the pad. She read it twice, thumb resting on the glass when she finished. "Anonymous," she said. "Could be a test. Could be," he agreed. She set it down carefully. "Then, I received 17 messages today, through my official diplomatic address, marked Velon's." She looked into her cup. One of them said she has been hiding her arms her entire adult life. Long sleeves every day, every temperature, every occasion. Because the markings on her arms go up to her elbows, and she learned as a child that the fastest way to make people comfortable was to make herself invisible. She paused. "She watched the ceremony feed and heard you say my name." She said it was the first time she had heard someone choose something like her out loud. "What did you write back?" James asked. "I have not yet. I do not know what to say. If it becomes known that I am corresponding with marked Velons about their visibility, Lord Kisson will call it evidence that I am here to agitate rather than to represent. And if you do not respond." She was quiet. "Theora, I know." She set down her cup. "I spent my entire life learning to make myself smaller so my presence would be tolerated. Standing at the end of lines, taking up no space, never drawing the kind of attention that would require powerful people to deal with me." She looked at him. "And now I am in the middle of everything, and people are watching. And I do not know how to tell the difference between right and dangerous." "Both," James said. "Probably both. But that woman with the long sleeves watched that ceremony and felt something change. That happened because you stood there. You did not do anything except, let me say your name, and something shifted for 17 people. That is not nothing. You were either very brave or very reckless," she said. "My supervisor would say the second one." "Your supervisor is probably right." But there was something new in her expression now. Not quite a smile, but its shape. "Go to sleep. James, whatever is coming tomorrow will come regardless." It came at 900 in the form of a formal summons from Ambassador Cross. James found the senior human delegates assembled in a conference room, carrying the atmosphere of people who had spent the night being worried and had now arrived at their conclusion. Cross sat at the head of the table. "You have created a situation," she said. "Your speech in the council chamber was recorded. The feed has been accessed over 300 times. It is the most discussed event on this station's communication network. Lord Kisson of House Ariel filed a formal protest with the Treaty Oversight Board this morning. He is claiming your selection constitutes cultural mockery. He is seeking 2 things: formal invalidation of the bonding exchange, and your removal from this delegation." The room was quiet. "One of the options available to us," Cross said carefully, "is for Theora to voluntarily withdraw. She could cite personal reasons, fatigue, anything she prefers. It would eliminate Kisson's formal basis for protest." "It is not my choice," James said. "It is hers. Then you should discuss it." He went back to their quarters and found Theora already reading the overnight feeds. She knew before he finished speaking. "They want me to step back," she said. "It is an option, not an order, but it is the option they prefer." She walked to the observation window and stood looking at the stars. "If I withdraw, it resolves the immediate problem. The treaty proceeds. And every marked Velon who watched that ceremony and felt something change goes back to feeling what they felt before." James said nothing. "I have spent my whole life stepping back," she said. "Every room I was not supposed to be in. I left before anyone had to ask me. Every time my presence created a problem, I made myself smaller so the problem went away." She crossed her arms. "I am tired of being the thing that gets removed when it becomes inconvenient." "Then do not be," James said. "The treaty should be able to contain one honest situation without falling apart. If it cannot, we should know that now. What if Kisson wins? What if the treaty fails? Then it breaks with us having said true things. That matters more than you think." She held his gaze for a long time. Then her shoulders came down slightly from where they had been sitting all morning. "All right," she said. "We do not withdraw." 2 days before the formal hearing, an artist named Gnarl published a series of digital portraits under the title Constellations. Theora recognized the name. circles for work the major institutions found philosophically irritating. Each image featured a Velon individual with natural markings, photographed in light that made the patterns look deliberate and complex and beautiful. It was technically just photography. The effect was something else entirely. Theora showed James the series on her datapad. He has made them look like something worth looking at, she said. They are worth looking at, James said. Traditional Velon media condemned the series within 6 hours. Younger Velons shared it in volumes that overwhelmed the station's minor networks. Fashionism
designers began experimenting with cuts that worked with patterned skin rather than against it.
In 48 hours, it was a cultural argument. Theora's inbox went from 17 messages to 260. She read everyone. She stopped covering her arms, not as a statement, just as a deliberate visibility, rather than an accidental one. That week she was approached at 2 diplomatic functions by other marked Velons, a junior translator, a very young aide who turned her arm over to show the markings on the inside of her wrist, presenting them like credentials. "You are doing something," the aide said in careful Velon. "I do not know what it is yet, but you are doing something." Lord Kisson's formal hearing convened 3 days after he filed his protest. In the station's central civic hall, James told Theora the night before, "I know what I am going to say. The truth," she said, same as before, with better acoustics this time. She almost smiled. "Do not say anything that cannot be unsaid. There are people in that room looking for a reason to hear the wrong thing. I promise I will say what needs to be said. That is the best I can offer." "Then say it well," she said. The hall held 300 people across tiered seating on 3 sides. Human delegates in the western tier, Velon officials in the eastern, neutral third-party observers in the northern gallery. Lord Kisson stood at the center of the floor when James and Theora entered. He looked at Theora the way you looked at a symbol, rather than a person. She was not a problem to him. She was an argument he needed to defeat. Kisson addressed the room for 7 minutes. He called James's choice deliberate provocation. He called the council speech presumption. He called the selection of Theora an act of condescension dressed as connection. He requested James's removal from the delegation and invalidation of the entire bonding exchange. He stepped back. The room exhaled. James walked to the center of the floor and stood where Kisson had stood. "Lord Kisson is right about one thing," he said. "It is a compelling story. I am going to tell it again, because I want to be clear about what actually happened." He told the full story, not the spare version from the council chamber, the complete one, because this room held 300 people and neutral observers, and a record being accessed in real time by feeds reaching far beyond this hall. The crash and the fear and the hours he had known he had left, the footsteps, the face deciding something, shelter and medicines, and a language built word by word. The morning the shuttle came, and the tree line she walked back into without looking back. She did all of that, he said, knowing discovery would cost her everything. Not a career setback, not a political complication, everything. The social contact that for a Velon is the actual substance of a life. She knew that and went anyway, because she found a dying stranger and decided his life mattered. He turned to face the eastern gallery. "Lord Kisson says I chose the worst. I want to be precise about what I chose. I chose the person who found me dying and made a decision. Not a calculated one, not a strategic one, but the kind that comes from somewhere policy does not reach. She acted at significant personal risk on the belief that a stranger's life mattered. Your system put her last in that line. My system put her first. I am suggesting, respectfully, that the difference between those two assessments is worth taking seriously. I did not come here to mock your culture," he said. "I came because both our species decided this alliance was worth building. I still believe that. But an alliance built on the premise that Theora of House Malin is something to be embarrassed about is not an alliance I can serve honestly." He looked at Kisson. "You asked this board to remove me. I understand why. I represent something inconvenient. But inconvenient is not the same as wrong." He walked back to his seat. Theora placed one marked hand over both of his without looking at him. Not a gesture for anyone to see. Just here. He held her hand and they waited. The motion to invalidate the treaty proceedings failed. 4 votes to 1. The motion to remove James from the delegation failed 3-2. Kisson received both outcomes with the stillness of a man who had been preparing his next move before the first one was finished. He gathered his materials and returned to the eastern gallery without looking at James or Theora. As they moved toward the exit, a young Velon aide pressed a physical note into James's hand and disappeared before he could respond. He read it in the corridor. "You speak truth. Some of us are listening. Keep speaking." He showed it to Theora. She read it. She folded it carefully and held it without speaking. That evening, an official message arrived on Theora's diplomatic terminal. Lord Kisson had filed an emergency petition directly to the Velon High Emissary, bypassing the oversight board entirely. It requested the treaty signing be suspended pending a full cultural integrity review, which by Velon law could take up to 3 months. Theora read it twice. She set the terminal down carefully. Then she said, "He is not done." "No," James agreed. "He is not." She looked at the observation window and the stars beyond it. "Then tell me what we do next." Episode 3, The Stars. The emergency petition moved through Velon administrative channels quickly. By the next morning, it had reached the High Emissary's office. By afternoon, the diplomatic community on Meridian Station knew it was under review. Kisson's argument was precise. He did not repeat the claim of deliberate mockery. He framed the petition around procedural stability, arguing that the controversy surrounding the bonding exchange had compromised the integrity of the negotiation environment, and that a review period was the responsible course of action. A 3-month delay would not kill the treaty. It would just make it much harder to hold together. 2 of the human delegation's senior members had assignments ending in 6 weeks. 2 Velon Council representatives were up for reappointment in 8. He knows he cannot win on the substance, Theora said, but he can win on procedure. What do you think the High Emissary will do? Unknown. She is not a Kisson ally, but she is traditional. And this week has been a great deal, James said. What does it mean if she grants the review? Theora was quiet for a moment. It means the constellations movement dies without the treaty as its foundation. It means the young aide who pressed that note into your hand goes back to silence. It means the girl with the long sleeves puts them back on. He said nothing. She looked at the window. I keep thinking about what you said in the hearing hall, that a system has to be able to contain an honest situation, or it was never worth much. She turned. Do you believe that? I do, even now, especially now. She held his gaze. Then we let it play out. We do the work. We let it be decided honestly. Then something shifted. Gnarl's Constellations series had been spreading steadily since its release, but the hearing changed its velocity. The story of the crash, told twice in recorded formal settings and now spreading through both human and Velon networks, had given the portraits context. People who had already seen the images now had a story to attach to them, and the combination of image and narrative did something neither had done alone. Young Velon fashion designers published their first openly marked skin-forward collections. Not all of them, and not most, but enough that the trend had a name by the time James heard about it. A Velon educational collective circulated the annotated constellations series among its students with discussion prompts. What makes something beautiful? Who decides? Can a standard be wrong? The collective marked the document for internal consideration only, which Theora explained was Velon bureaucratic language, for we have decided to do this, but we would prefer the major houses not notice immediately. They are teaching it, she told James, looking at the document on her pad. To children. Is that surprising? Yes, she set the pad down, because children remember things. They grow up carrying what they were taught in those rooms. And if what they are being taught is different from what came before. She stopped. It takes a generation to change a culture. Maybe 2. I will not see the end of it. She was quiet for a moment, but it started. It started before any of this, James said. She looked at him. The moment you climbed down into that crater, he said. That was the first decision. Everything after is just the consequence. She was quiet for a long time. Then, you always make it sound so simple. It is simple, not easy, but simple. She looked at him steadily. Then, not as though she had decided to, but as though the decision had already been made somewhere, and this was just when it became visible. She reached across the space between them and took his hand. Not briefly, a hold, the kind that meant she was staying. He held hers back. The High Emissary's response to Kisson's petition arrived 36 hours later. The request for a 3-month cultural integrity review was denied. The reason cited was brief and formal. The bonding exchange protocols, including the provision for singular candidate selection, had been followed correctly. The resulting pairing, however unconventional, fell within established precedent. The broader cultural questions raised by the week's events were questions that the treaty itself was designed to create space to address over time. Suspending the process would not resolve them. It would simply remove the space. Kisson read the decision in the Eastern Gallery, and his expression did not change. But across the station, in the communication networks and informal conversations and data feeds that moved faster than any official channel, something else was moving. The Constellations series passed 4,000 views, then 8,000. The educational collective's discussion prompts were shared by 3 more collectives. Marked Velons, who had attended diplomatic functions in concealing clothing, began appearing in something different. You are inspiring them just by existing, James told Theora. I am terrified, she said, but I am tired of being ashamed of something I cannot control. That is braver than pride, he said. The night before the signing, James could not sleep. The briefing documents were read and set aside. His prepared remarks had been written, reviewed by Cross, revised twice, and filed. Everything that could be prepared had been prepared. What remained was the particular useless wakefulness of a person lying in the dark, being too aware that tomorrow existed. He gave up around 200 and went to the observation window. He heard her before he saw her, the soft sound of her crossing the room, the slight change in the air when someone came to stand beside you. Theora settled next to him without speaking. They looked at the stars together for a while, and the station hummed around them with the low, constant sound of a structure that did not have opinions about what was happening inside it. Tomorrow, she said eventually. Tomorrow, he agreed. Are you nervous? Not about the ceremony, about the part after. You ask me what happens when the treaty is signed and the exchange is complete. I have been thinking about it, and I do not have a clean answer. The practical architecture of how this continues is genuinely complicated. My posting, your research assignment, the distance between our worlds. He paused. But I keep coming back to the fact that I spent 5 years trying to get back to a conversation that was interrupted. I do not want another interruption. She was quiet for a moment. When I was young, before I understood what my markings meant to the world, I used to think I would build a life in spite of them, that I would work hard enough and achieve enough that the markings would become irrelevant. She paused. It does not work that way. You do not outrun the thing people have decided to see. I learned that early and built my expectations smaller. This week I have had to keep stopping myself, she continued. Every time something happens, the messages, the constellations series, the hearing, I catch myself believing in it and then immediately looking for the reason it will fail. The habit of small expectations. She turned to look at him. And then I look at you. And you look like none of that ever occurred to you as a possibility. And I genuinely cannot decide if that is strength or naivety. Probably both. You told me that. I tell you things, and then you use them against me. I keep them, he said. There is a difference. Theora, I know the architecture is complicated. I know there will be political pressure and cultural friction. I know it will not be simple. He reached out and took her hand, the marked one, the one with the patterns running up toward her wrist. But the most important decision I have made in 5 years was deciding not to let you stay in that tree line permanently. I am not interested in a smaller version of this because the larger one is complicated. You are, she said quietly, the most stubborn person I have ever encountered. Is that good or bad? In this context, she curled her fingers around his. Good, mostly. They stood at the window together for a long time without speaking much. The kind of conversation that did not need language, because it was mostly about 2 people standing close enough that the space between them was a choice. At some point, Theora said, James, I have something for you. She stepped to the small cabinet beside the workstation and took something out, holding it in both hands for a moment before turning. It was a crystal, small enough to fit in one palm, faceted in a way that caught the room's dim light and made it interior, as though the light was living inside the object rather than bouncing off it. Inside, projected from the cut faces, a holographic display resolved into the shapes of star charts, constellations, none that he recognized. I contacted Gnarl, Theora said, after the portrait series. I told him what you had said about the markings looking like star maps. She held the crystal out, and he took it, and the holographic display shifted in his hands as he turned it. He spent 2 days doing the actual mapping, taking photographs of my markings, plotting the pattern coordinates, calculating what they would look like if they were stars viewed from a fixed point. These are the marks on my left forearm, and these are my face. He extrapolated the rest. James held the crystal and looked at the constellations turning slowly inside it, and did not speak for a moment. They were real constellations, not metaphor. Gnarl had done the mathematics, and what came out the other side was actual star charts, her skin translated into sky. They had the particular slightly chaotic density of real star formations, rather than invented ones. They looked like something that existed somewhere, waiting to be navigated by. The chaos marks of House Malin, Theora said, as a star atlas. He looked up at her. She was watching his face with the careful attention of someone for whom the response mattered, and who was trying not to show how much. This is extraordinary, he said, plainly, without embellishment. The way you said something when you wanted the weight of it to land without decoration. Something in her face shifted. You said my markings looked like star maps. I wanted to know if it was true. She nodded at the crystal. It is. Apparently, it is. He looked at it again. Thank you. You made me see them that way, she said. The crystal is just the thing that existed when I stopped only taking your word for it and looked for myself. The signing was held at midday in the grand hall where the bonding exchange had taken place 12 days earlier. The room looked different in daylight. The crystalline walls caught the full spectrum overhead lighting and scattered it into a moving prismatic effect along the upper walls. The delegates were arranged in the same careful geography as before, the same formal dress, the same tiered positions. But the energy had changed enough that the similarity felt like a different kind of observation. James and Theora stood among the other bonded pairs along the hall's inner perimeter. Richard and Solara stood 2 positions to their left. Richard had undergone a quiet recalibration over the past week, the slightly chastened look of someone who had expected to be the most significant person in a room and had discovered that significance did not work the way he had assumed. James watched Theora more than he watched the ceremony. She was standing straight, head up, chin level. Not the performed composure of someone fighting to look appropriate, but the natural stillness of someone who had decided in the past 12 days that she belonged exactly where she was. Her marked hands were clasped in front of her, not tight, just resting. The difference between bracing and simply being. Several people in the room were looking at them. She knew it. It no longer made her smaller. In the gallery above, a cluster of younger Velon attendees wore clothing that had not been common when James arrived at the station. Cuts and fabrics that did not conceal. Not all of them were marked. Some wore the open styles in aesthetic solidarity. A few had marks visible on their necks and hands, patterns catching light the way Theora's did. They were standing together, the way people stood when they had found each other after looking. The signing happened. Formal words, formal gestures. The particular gravity of 2 civilizations, putting their names to something and meaning to hold it. When the High Emissary's signature was confirmed and the documentation sealed, the Velon delegates produced a collective resonant harmonic. Not quite music. Something felt more than heard. The human delegates responded with applause, uncertain in timing but genuine. The layered sounds filled the hall's acoustics and became something greater than either component alone. Theora's hand found his. We did it, she said, quiet enough that it was only for him. We did more than sign a treaty, he said. We started a conversation. She looked at the room, all of it, and something moved across her face that was not quite any single emotion, but was made of several of them. Yes, she said, I think we did. The High Mediator found them near the end of the reception, when the room had thinned and the remaining conversations were winding toward their conclusions. She was alone. No aid, no formal accompaniment. In Velon culture, this was a gesture of intentional informality. I am choosing to speak, not to pronounce. She stopped before them. James Carter, she said, High Mediator, you have created unprecedented disruption. She said it without hostility, more like an observation about weather. Your presence in these proceedings will be discussed in political theory for some time. I hope they get the story right, James said. Whether they do or not is at least partially your responsibility to ensure. She turned to Theora, and something in the steadiness of her gaze was different from the look of any other official who had directed attention at Theora in this hall. Not approval exactly, something more considered, something that might in time become it. Theora of House Malin. Theora met her eyes. High Mediator, you were not designed for this moment, the Mediator said. No one was. But here it is, and here you are inside it. She paused. There are those of us who have spent our lives maintaining the standards we were given without asking whether those standards had examined themselves with the same rigor we applied to everything else. It is uncomfortable to find that they may not have. Thank you, Theora said, clean and direct, not grateful in the diminished way of someone thanking a superior for basic acknowledgement, but the simple thanks of one person receiving something genuine from another. The mediator inclined her head, slightly lower than rank strictly required, and walked away. They left Meridian Station 6 days later. James had 3 weeks before he was expected back at his Earthside posting. Theora had 2 weeks before her first assignment under the new treaty's Joint Research Program, a position offered to her specifically by the coordinating body. They were going to the same place, the first joint research station established at a point in space equidistant between Earth and the Velon home system, a location that belonged equally to neither. James had volunteered for a posting there. Theora's assignment was there. The coincidence had been engineered by both of them independently and discovered simultaneously. And when they had realized what the other had done, neither of them had said anything for a moment, and then Theora had made a sound that might have been a laugh. In the months that followed, their story became the kind of story that got told in different versions by different people, each version true to whoever was telling it. The treaty held. The joint research station opened on schedule. James and Theora worked there together and were, by every professional metric available, extremely effective. It was also the best thing either of them had. The constellations movement grew unevenly, with setbacks and reversals. The kind of 2 steps forward progress that made you wonder if it was moving at all until you compared it to where it had started. Traditional beauty standards did not change overnight. They changed the way cultures changed, gradually then in lurches, with resistance at every stage and pockets of unexpected momentum in places no one had predicted. But they changed. Marked Velons in the research communities began presenting their work under their own names. A young fashion designer from a minor house released a collection that sold out in 6 hours. The secondary educational collective quietly made the annotated Constellation series part of its standard curriculum, and when no major houses objected, 3 others did the same. Lord Kisson did not stop. He regrouped and reargued and found new angles. The old certainties did not die, but they shared space now with new questions, and questions were harder to argue against than counterpositions. Theora answered all 412 messages. She wrote back to the girl with the long sleeves once a month for a year, then more often, and eventually their correspondence became something else. A document collaboratively written about the experience of being marked in a society that had decided what the marks meant. Published through an independent Velon intellectual channel and downloaded 60,000 times in its first week. She stopped covering her arms, not as a statement, after a while, just as the natural consequence of having stopped having a reason to. James kept the crystal on his desk at the research station. Some nights, when the station was quiet and the observation windows showed the same stars that had kept him company through a week of impossible things, he would pick it up and watch the constellations turn inside it and think about a crater in orange dirt and a face looking down at him, and a decision being made. One evening, Theora came to find him there. She sat beside him, close in the easy way of people who had worked out proximity over time. She took the crystal from his hands and held it between them, and they both looked at the turning light inside it. Her skin mapped to stars, her chaos marks made navigable. The thing her society had called disorder translated into something you could steer by. You never hesitated, she said, in that hall. When they expected you to choose the other way, you did not pause. You just said my name. James looked at the crystal, at her hands holding it. I had already chosen, he said, 5 years ago, when you chose to save me. The ceremony was just making it official. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the observation window, the stars held their usual indifferent constancy, present and navigable, there whether you looked or not. Will you always choose me? She asked. When it gets difficult, when the pressure comes back and choosing me costs something. Especially then, he said. That is when it matters. She looked at him for a long moment, the amber eyes with their scattered flecks, the marks on her face that Gnarl had turned into star charts, the copper in her silver hair that caught light differently from everything around it. Her marked hand found his. Then I choose you too, she said. I keep choosing, every day. Even the hard ones. He held her hand, and the station hummed, and the stars were there. And sometimes, in the quiet hours, Theora would trace the patterns on her own skin, slowly, with the attention of someone learning to see something that had always been there, and find that what she saw had changed. Not the patterns themselves. Those were exactly what they had always been. What had changed was her, and the looking, and the word she had for what she found. Not defect, not chaos, stars.